Sue. He would have been well aware, and he was asked about the booze at full time, the singing of Thomas Tuchel and Roman Abramovich. OK, how big a pickle is Potter in at the moment?
He is in a pickle, and I think he's fully aware of that. And I think taking the job from the Brighton role, he knew that the expectation was going to be completely different. Chelsea are expected to be competing for league titles, competing in all cup competitions. The results haven't been good enough. The performances on the whole haven't been good enough. I think there's other factors around that. You've got to pick out the injuries and the injuries to key players that they've got. I think any side would miss the players that they're missing, and how much the Chelsea rely on the two fullbacks, Chilwell and James. When I watched Chelsea against Bournemouth and Reece James played, they were a completely different side. But the players that are on the pitch, they had enough experience, maybe not. They had some quality players on there that didn't perform at the levels that you would expect them to perform at against a very good Manchester City side, but they just didn't seem to have any sort of belief. The minimum is you want them to work really hard, don't you? You want them to give absolutely everything, and you just didn't really see that, because it was billed as the tie of the round. Everyone wanted to watch that. You watched them in the league and it was much closer, but that was just a stroll in the park for Manchester City, and that's just not good enough for Chelsea.
I think what perhaps sparked the ire of Chelsea fans was maybe the quote afterwards of, this is Manchester City, they're a very good team, this is what we aspire to be, Stephen. It is barely 20 months since Chelsea beat Manchester City in a Champions League final. Chelsea don't aspire, according to the fans, to be like Manchester City. They actually should be better than Manchester City. That's the way the fans hear it. And for a manager to say that's what we aspire to be actually is denigrating what they were before. Let's have a look at the team that played Manchester City in that Champions League final. OK, Rudiger's gone, and you could argue that could Chelsea have done more to keep him? Timo Werner has gone. You could make the argument of why on earth let Lukaku go and Werner go in the same transfer window and not replace him. Mendy injured, James injured, Kante injured, Chilwell injured. But apart from that core of that team is still there.
OK. The big thing for me when I look at that is there's 6 players there. Take out of the equation the goalkeeper, because he's not involved in this. And the reason is every single one of those players has got what? Pace. Every single one of them has got pace to burn. The one thing about the Premier League is you have to be athletic, you have to be able to run, you have to be able to get in behind and stretch the pitch as much as you can. You look at the two wing-backs, we go back to them constantly because they are a huge loss, but they have both got pace to burn. They play high up the pitch, they've got high energy levels. Rudiger at the back could play the high line because he has pace to burn. You think about his performances against Liverpool, against Mohamed Salah. So often we saw him going tight on Salah, not afraid to do it in 1v1 situations because he is blessed with pace. You see him now at Real Madrid, and when he plays for Real Madrid can play a high line because they know Rudiger's at the back and he's got that pace to get him to recover into position. So you have to adapt your team, adapt your game with the players. They haven't replaced with pace. Koulibaly, not quick, to a certain degree he is, but he's not the player that Rudiger is. He's a downgrade on Rudiger, and that's my personal opinion. I think he's a good player. I think he needs time to adapt to the league, and will he improve? I'm sure he will. But they aren't at the same phase they were 18 months ago. They are in, I hate this word, it drives me insane, transition. They are in transition to a certain degree. They do need improvements. I think, just going off piste a little bit, the big thing for me at the moment is, and a lot of fans obviously yesterday singing for Tuchel, singing for Roman Abramovich. Graham Potter's also in a fortunate situation where obviously Abramovich isn't in charge, because if he was, he'd be under huge pressure. I think the situation with Todd Bowley at the moment is in America, you can have a bad year because there isn't any relegation. I'm talking about NFL and things. You go for the Super Bowl or you go for the title. You don't go for anything else. There isn't Champions League football. There isn't the reward of bigger money when that happens and getting in those situations, the big European nights. And whether he understands that fully, what's expected of Chelsea at the moment, I don't know whether he does. And I'm fascinated to know that, because to say at the moment where Chelsea are, they need big improvements.
Okay. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I know that Chelsea fans don't like the word transition, but they are, in terms of the ownerships. You know, that's different, the new manager coming in. And I think this is quite an interesting point to see where we are with the owners, because this would be an opportunity to get rid of Graham Potter. And like you said, under the old regime, potentially that could have happened.
Yeah.
Now we'll see if they are an ownership that is going to stick with them and stick with this longer term project, allow the injured players to come back, and then we can then judge Graham Potter. So it will be interesting to see what they do. OK,
I want to tie those 2 points together, Stephen, and put this to you. You were talking about Koulibaly being a downgrade on Rudiger. You talked about losing the pace. You talked about Burley perhaps coming from the American culture into the English culture. If we have a look at his buys that have happened, and he hasn't been shy of spending money, so we've got to say that. But if we look at these buys here, Zakaria not on there because he's a loan, but you can see he's spent 341.4 million. Mm-hmm. You look at the big buys, and Cucurella, has he been a success at Chelsea? Most probably not. Raheem Sterling finding it difficult to settle in there. You mentioned Koulibaly, Fofana with those injuries that he's had. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang bought in there as well.
Yeah.
Is it astounding to you as a football person that they've now brought in a sporting director in Vivell, but they got rid of the likes of Petr Cech, who knew the club inside out, who knew the market, who knew what Chelsea were about? Was that a fundamental error?
Quite possibly, but then a new owner will often want his own people on the ground doing the work. I think that, again, there's got to be a process where you use them people for a certain amount of time to make that change and make that transitional period as smooth as possible. I think when you look at the signings, I think no one would have foreseen Raheem Sterling struggling, but he's struggling in a struggling team. It's not like he's come into a team that's playing really well and he's not found form. He did okay at the start under Tuchel, did well, not a problem.
And he's been playing out position.
Yeah, the ones I find interesting was, and spoke about it at the time, was Cucurella's had one good season and the fee was astronomical for him. It was a huge fee. Now, we talk about Graham Potter going to a big club and expectation. He's got exactly the same on his shoulders for a big fee. It's almost like he's expected to do more. So he's got that problem. Who was going to say then? Centre-back from Leicester. Fofana. You look at him. How do you sign a player for 75 million who's had an Achilles injury for a year? You've got to see his recovery. I mean, to sign him off the back of that, and I know he went to America and he did all this testing, but we look at players and often they do okay for a short period of time when they come back, and then other things start to happen. His injury record's incredible. It's absolutely terrible, but you've put a huge outlay on these players straight away. Two players who haven't done it, so you've got best part of, 140, 130 million on two players that it's not worked.
Well, let's pick up on the injury, shall we? Because you've mentioned it and you've just mentioned it. This is their injury list. I was reading a recent article that said that Chelsea, since last season, have suffered 97 injuries. That's 16 more than any other side across Europe's top 5 leagues. OK, along with Liverpool last season, nobody played more games than Chelsea. Fact. But what Chelsea did was the club doctor, Paco Biosca, and the head physio, Thierry Laurent, left the club. This was part of the cull under the new ownership. And they believed that at the time, their thinking was that City, Liverpool and even Brighton had more progressive medical departments than they did. But it's still not been resolved. There has been question marks over the rushing back of Fofana and Reece James in particular. So is this, yes, the injuries have hampered Potter, but is this a situation of their own making here? Is there something beneath the surface here?
Well, I think when you've got so many injuries, I think of course, you've got to look at, like, say, the amount of games that they've played and the recovery in between those games. But you've got to look at the bigger picture then, haven't you? Well, why are they getting these injuries and why are so many players getting these injuries? Are they rushing players back? I'm sure they desperately wanted to get Reece James back, but was that the right time for him to come back? He's broke down again. And so I suppose, you know, we're all looking, because the manager gets the blame. When teams don't perform and they don't get results, straight away we look at what can Graham Potter do better. But I suppose not looking at that, he's inherited this squad. It's not his fault that these players have got injured. So I suppose from that perspective, that's why I'm still quite neutral on Graham Potter in terms of when he gets everybody back fit. I think that's when we can properly judge him. But I'm sure that Chelsea will be looking at the medical department and going, well, why are we picking up all of these injuries? Some of them are freak injuries, aren't they? And yeah, which was, you know, and again, that's had an impact going forward. You look at Chelsea at the moment where that's their problem. They struggle to score goals. They struggle in that final third. At times you see them playing through the thirds. They get to that final third and there's not that quality. So yes, you can say, well, they're lacking the two wing backs in Chilwell and Reece James in providing that quality. It's not worked with Aubameyang. Brogy's obviously got injured and Havertz is probably not your out-and-out number 9 that you need. So that's probably where the investment needs to happen. So looking at those players, a list of players, how many of them are actually worth what was paid for them, and is it actually what Chelsea needed at the time?
Is there a moment when a transition period, as you don't like it to be called, so let's use that as a funding one. Is there a moment where actually you've got to say, this isn't transition, this is reverse, this is decline?
Yeah, to a certain degree, Will. I'm sure. Listen, the record speaks for itself at the moment. It's not going well for Graham Potter, but he needs time to be able to implement his system. I think the big thing for me is when I've watched them, and I was at the Nottingham Forest game last week, they were so similar to the way Brighton play, where there was no dynamic edge in the forward areas. There was no individual players taking people on. It's almost like it's a calculated game. There's no risk taken within the system. There's no players trying to push passes through. It's almost very stat-driven football, where it's all possession-based and the numbers are good and things like that. I want to see players taking gambles and taking risks. Just to go back on the point where we were talking about the injury thing with Reece James, wonder how much Reece James had an influence on that as well. Desperate to get back, desperate to play. Sometimes it's very difficult for physios because the players push it as well. My other side of it would be, what was the setup at the start of the season? I think this was arguably the hardest season for managers, fitness, sports science people. How do they manage with a World Cup in the middle of it? What's the load before it? What's the load during it, after it? Also as well, would that have been a point where you'd say, do you know what, let's just keep it as it is for this period because this is being set up for the season? To change it mid-season might have influenced it in a way. We don't know. We don't know the quality of people who've come in, where they're from, what the background is. I'm sure Graham Potter will have done his due diligence. I'm sure the Chelsea owners will have as well. But sometimes you've got to admit defeat and say, we've got it wrong. And I'm not talking about the manager, I'm talking about the injury records and things like that, the sports science, the medical departments behind the scenes, because they've never had to do this before. They've never had to deal with a situation where you've had a World Cup in the middle of the season.
Other teams have got to deal with it. Arsenal seem to be coping with it okay.
I know, but the thing is, that's great saying that, but my ideas might be different to yours, and I might get it wrong and you might get it right, and that's the difference. They might have thought at the beginning of it, looking at all the history of data and the way things were, speaking to experts in the field, that was the way to do it, and it hasn't been that way.
Yep. Chelsea currently 10th. 10 seems to be the number for them. 10 points off the top 4, but also 10 points off the bottom 3 as they sit at the moment. And the fixtures coming up. Fulham first up on Thursday, and then Palace at home on the Sunday. So do they have to get 6 points from those two games?
Absolutely. And I think Graham Potter knows that. And I think he knows I spoke about the expectation. The expectation is for Chelsea to start rising up the table, and where their goal is, whether that's top 4 now, whether that's top 6, they have to start picking up results, and performances have to be better, and that starts against Fulham.